Okay. Um, Henry, this was an awesome presentation, and maybe it's because of our age. I really enjoyed that there was a more perspective in it, right? I mean, IoT is so overhyped in the last 1 or 2 years that we forget that IoT is not just something which fell out of the valley or out of the sky, but actually has been called M2M and has been with us for 20 years. And I really enjoyed that some perspective there. When I have this talk in the valley, usually I try to puncture the bubble a little bit, but I have the feeling that maybe here we can have a more rational debate about it. The way I work is usually I like to have conversations, twofold. A, so I learn something. Second, I get Matt to run around and hand over the mic. And given the amount of food he ate yesterday, I think he needs a little bit of walking. So feel free to ask questions, even interject and say, oh, well, what you're saying here doesn't make sense, and I have a better view of it. Okay, let's get started. Goal of this presentation is not to give you answers. What I hope to give you is some pointers, some grounding in what we think the reality is, and maybe give you some pointers you can look up if you're interested and find out more. But just to kind of give you a base level that when people talk about IoT, that you have an idea about what that really means, in particular from a technology stack and from a business side. So let's get started. I like this picture. It shows, it's quaint. It's almost like 90s. It's a university website. On this side is things on the front page of a university website, and on this side is things people go to the site looking for. And as you noticed, the overlap is rather small, the full name of the school. And similarly in IoT, there is so much hype, so much marketing out there, that it's almost hard to pierce through the fog of marketing and pitches and to understand what's really behind it, right? So again, I want to empower you to look a little bit through that fog and understand, what are the trade-offs, what is there. And I do know I have a harder time now because the talk about the oil field was about actual in-the-field M2M communication, where some of the stuff people claim for IoT, for consumer-facing IoT, actually is a real requirement, where some of the other stuff people claim for IoT in the consumer space, I personally think is fluff and not worth your time actually investigating. This is the idea. How will the Internet of Things shape API design? Let me start with a little bit of a business-like approach. Everyone here, I assume, can build an API within minutes, right? Building an API is not rocket science anymore. Maybe never was. But there's a difference between building an API and doing an effective API. And what do I mean by effective API? I mean an API which meets your business objective. So it's not like you build it and they will come. Most of the time they don't. So first, get clear on why you need an API, what is the business objective. And to help you think through that, I want to introduce you to something we call the API value chain. Now, value chain is a common concept in business, in the business world, right? It kind of shows how you start with something like a resource and you add value to it until you have an end consumer paying for it, right? And the interesting thing in the API value chain, they always start out with a business asset, like that rod, that radioactive rod, that source, I think it was called, right? That's a valuable business asset. You want to track that. It could be map data, right? Like Google Maps. That's valuable data. But Google Maps didn't start out by someone saying, I want to build a map API, and I figure out what to show in that API. Secondly, no, it was like Google had all that data, and they said, how can we monetize that data? So everything starts from business asset. Then you have an API provider. That could be in control of the business asset, or it could not be. But the key is the API provider doesn't just deal with the API itself. No, it also deals with the SLA, with the end user license agreement. So there's more to it. There's a technical contract, and there's a legal contract. And then the API provider doesn't talk to him. He talks to the developer who uses that API and is building an app or an application or something with it. And then this application, he then tries to get the application in the hands of the end consumer, and the app is using the API, and then at some point comes the end user and using the API. Now, what do I mean by effective API design? It's essentially the relationship between the API provider and the developer, right? You need to design the API in such a way that the developer can do their job well to build an app which is meaningful to the end consumer. So think about that for a second, right? You're not building an API for the end consumer. The end consumer doesn't care about your API. He just cares about what he can do with the app using your API. So he needs to feel your love. And effective API design essentially means we have in usability, we have UX. And my colleague Ronnie, who we're going to talk later, we're trying to establish a concept of DX, developer experience. So keep that in mind. Now, what does that mean, coming back, what does it mean in terms of IoT? So when you go to the meetups, to the conferences, et cetera, you usually end up with like 4 or 5 points everyone seems to agree upon what IoT means, right? And you can go through, like low power. There's the presumption that whatever we do, it needs very low power. Limited bandwidth, there's the assumption that you can send kilobytes of data, not megabits or megabytes or gigabytes, right? Many messages, many small little messages. There are entire companies founded on that premise. I can send tiny little messages over limited bandwidth on low power. Asynchronous, things are just happening, right? It's not like a request-response model where you can ask, did the door open? Did the door open? Did the door open? No, it's like the door opens and you want to be getting a message. So there's a different pattern. For those of you who have been around in the industry a little bit longer, there's nothing new, right? We have pub-sub models in the industry for a long time, especially in the financial industry, credit cards, et cetera, using MQ or ActiveMQ, et cetera. So this kind of asynchronous messaging is being assumed that that's going to be one of the major interaction models in IoT. Autonomous, that's an interesting one. There's a company out in the valley who is genius in getting you to dump your fully functional, fully workable iPhone 4, which you bought 1 year ago for $500, was it now $500, $600 without contract, and get you to buy you a new one, a new iPhone, right? For the same amount of money. Phone is still perfectly fine, but their genius in marketing is such that you want to have that new one. Now, if you're like me, now I know I'm German, I'm culturally biased towards a little bit not spending so much money, but you're not going to do that with your toaster. You're probably not going to do that with your refrigerator. I don't even think you're going to do that with your car. So what I mean by autonomous and long living is that as things get connected, you have to think already today about what is the average lifespan of that thing, right? It could be, when we talk about whitewares, like washing machines, et cetera, we're talking about 5, 6 years, easily. If you're looking at something like Miele or some of the higher brands, you're talking about 10, 15 years. Now think about that. What does it mean that you build an API with clients which are potentially not field upgradable, where you have to keep the API steady and stable and available for the next 10, 15 years? Because I bet you, if you're coming out with a product that a customer buys, and 2 years down the road you're saying, nah, let's forget that API, let's do something else. and the customer gets this little message, sorry, your access to your API just expired. Tough luck for you, right? He's never going to come back and buy from you, right? So there is, whereas before we kind of, when we did API design and just writing software, we always assumed, well, we can just upgrade, right? Which was a fallacy already back then, but it even becomes more a fallacy once that software is sitting in a flash and an EEPROM in some kind of thing which people have in their houses, and they do not gonna exchange. So autonomous, maybe I should have written also long living design. And then, of course, many connected applications and systems. So and if you're looking at the space now, there's like this Cambrian explosion of technology, right? A lot of frameworks claim that they're going to solve all those problems for you. Aware of peer-to-peer technology, essentially creating a mesh of mobile devices where you route hop by hop across connected mobile devices to build kind of like a parallel network. Now, some of you might ask, well, what are doing Couchbase and Firebase in here? Let me share you a little story. I went to a hackathon. Part of my job, or part of the enjoyable part, is that I can go to those and don't have to ask for permission. So I was a mentor there for APIs. And I stood there, you know, and all those guys, it was a mobile hackathon. They were all kind of hacking away. And no one came to me and asked me anything. Which, made me start think about, am I still in the right business? Because obviously my skills seem to not longer be relevant. But B, what were they all doing? The mobile has to talk to something. So I finally grabbed a mobile dev guy, and he says, APIs? Oh man, I'm not using APIs. I use CouchDB, I use MobileDB. I have my database on my mobile. There's an eventual synchronization happening with the backend, so I'm using this as a data persistence layer across sometimes connected systems. It's great. I don't have to deal with anything anymore. I have a database here, I have the database back there, and eventually they sync up and I get my stuff, and I have a actually decent offline behavior because I still have data on my mobile, and it's not just hanging there trying to get to a server, which happens to be on an interstate in, I don't know, I don't want to say Texas, maybe, what, Oklahoma or something like this, where there's no connectivity. So, which is interesting because that means maybe APIs actually get submerged in some kind of data persistence layer which can survive potential outages of connectivity. So this is why I put Couchbase and Firebase there, because that's their reason of being. And they're aggressively going after IoT and other kind of use cases where maybe the thing is connected, maybe not, but it shouldn't matter on how you use it. So, lots of frameworks, lots of protocols. So you thought the world is settled around HTTP. There is a lot of marketing money thrown at you to convince you otherwise. And most of you probably know XMPP, right? The granddaddy of chat. XMPP is actually doing very well in IoT because it's established. It has a very strong security model built around it. We know it's scalable. The only thing it is, which people don't like, that it's XML. But if you get over that hump, actually XMPP is a very decent protocol. Interestingly enough, a lot of the IoT network topologies look very much like chat topologies, right? You have presence, a thing comes on, a thing goes off. You can communicate with that thing, aka some member of a chat community. While it's on, when it's gone, it's, you know, it buffers somewhere that the messages then reach it when it comes back online. Another granddaddy, most of us actually most people who work in the industry probably know, it's called DDS. It's a very early PubSub protocol. It's very big in military and it's very big in medical devices. They are now making a run and claiming we are the IoT protocol. There is MQTT, open source by IBM, heavily promoted by Eclipse, who has nothing to do with the old MQ, except for the same concept. It has similar, like, you know, deliver once and only once, deliver at least once. So it has like different classifications. It's a very slim protocol, PubSub protocol. which with all the IBM marketing power behind it claims that they are the one IoT protocol you should only care about. CoAP. There is a, obviously ARM looked at what IBM did and said, well, we have to do something different. So there's it's an official RFC now, CoAP. There's a direct mapping between HTTP REST and CoAP possible. Interestingly enough, there's an industry consortium now building around ARM, focusing on pushing CoAP as the IoT protocol. Then we have WAMP, which is a very interesting protocol from the W3 work groups. And just for good measures, there's a brilliant little text-based PubSub protocol called Stomp, which is just, I just love for its simplicity and brilliance. But I think what you start seeing here is already, right, there's an ARM camp, there's an IBM camp, somewhere there's a Cisco camp, right? You see kind of industries aligning around protocols with the goal of being the next HTTP and kind of having a hold on your wallets and checks and IT investments. So just be aware of that, right? And there's obviously a lot of marketing. And so I captured a little exchange here between Joe Speed, former head of marketing in IBM, now head of IoT at the Linux Foundation. He says, and analysts like GigaOM are writing that HTTP-based protocols are a dumb way to do mobile apps, that MQTT is more reliable. To which Michael Holdman, who is in a company who promotes XMPP-based products, writes, I seem to think there were tons of articles touting OS2 as the OS of the future at one point. Amazing what unlimited supply of advertising dollars can get people to say. I'm not going to judge one or the other. I know both. Actually, I like both. But it just kind of, when you read statements about IoT and this protocol and that protocol and forget HTTP and this is the brave new world, keep in mind, follow the money. Sometimes it's very easy to see where you're being subjected to marketing messaging rather than technical messaging. So even further, and now here's where I have a little bit of a tension right now, because obviously we just saw real M2M on the field, on the ground applications, which do have a lot of those requirements. But for most consumer IoT, I would question almost all of those assumptions. Is it really true that there's low power? Well, most of my things are within a meter, 3 feet of a power plug or a power supply, right? An power outlet. Sorry. Limited bandwidth. Well, where do my things live? Most of the times they live within a Wi-Fi saturated area, be it here, be it in the office, be it in the coffee shop, be it at home. I don't think my thing has to be concerned about either power or bandwidth. Many messages, we can debate about that. It's essentially a design decision, in my mind. I do agree that asynchronous behavior will be predominant over request-reply as we know today. And I do agree that autonomous, long-living system, that kind of design implication there, are relevant. Many connected application and systems, there seems to be this orthodoxy, assuming that everything goes to the cloud. Well, I don't know about you, but really, do I need to have everything on the cloud? What happens if the cloud goes away? Does it mean I can't toast anymore or wash anymore or do this stuff, right? Why can't this just be within my home? Why does it need to be the cloud? I don't know if you guys followed, right? One of the, I think a Korean TV manufacturer was just dinged on collecting all your viewing behaviors and shipping it off for analysis. I don't know if it was LG or one of Samsung. And it's incredible. I mean, maybe you don't care, maybe I don't care, but at least I want to have a choice. I mean, what do they care about what I'm watching, right? But there's this orthodoxy repeating over again, IoT means something in the cloud, and then little dumb nodes just pumping stuff up. And that may be true, but maybe it doesn't need to be true. It's your design decision, you as an engineer, you as product architects. And I think the two things we should focus on, where I see the impact on IoT, on API designs, is we can debate if it's called real-time APIs, pub/sub APIs, asynchronous APIs. It doesn't matter. The point is, it's not a request-response pattern, but it's more like a publish-subscribe pattern, right? And I think you will see more of those kind of APIs emerging and technologies emerging, and those are the ones you should be paying attention to. And then I think long-living autonomous systems. We are fortunate to have Mike Amundsen. He's part of the API Academy. He's, for me at least, one of the fathers of hypermedia. So if you start thinking about long-living systems and thinking about API design, do yourself a favor and start reading up on hypermedia, or the real Fielding's API. What that, in a nutshell, what hypermedia allows you is to build an API which is robust to change. So you can change the API after you release that. If the client is able to follow the hypermedia concept, the client can adapt. So you're not locked in with an API for the next 10 years you can't change. Yes, it means a little bit more investment on the client side. It means a new concept of following relation tags instead of hard-coding URLs. The good news is you can change that API. You get a degree of freedom to continue to innovate and do all kinds of cool stuff after that thing is in the field and maybe is not field upgradable. Okay, just a bunch of questions you can ask yourself when you design your future IoT killer product, home, office, or outside. I think I talked already, right? If you're in the home and the office, a lot of constraints fall away because there's a power outlet, there's Wi-Fi. If you're outside, you know, by all means, we're talking about SMS, cellular coverage, etc. Sigfox, long and extremely long-range wireless standard, which is very popular. Mobile or stationary, wearable or built-in, autonomous are always connected. These are questions only you can answer, but I just kind of want to give you some pointers there. This is my personal question I always kind of like to raise. And I can admit, maybe I'm culturally biased, right? I do not want to have a digital shadow for everything in the cloud. I do not. You have to decide for yourself if you need one. Implicit in a lot of this talk about clouds is that somehow sending data is always cheaper than calculating locally. Ask yourself that question. What gives better value to my customers? Sending it there or calculating it locally? This obviously is something which is hard to kind of justify or talk about in like measurable technical terms. But what we notice is there's a reason why we are here at an API conference, right? Something about APIs worked, which didn't work with web services. There's no SOA success story, but there are API success stories, right? But there seems to be always this trend back to, oh, let me come up with a WSDL for APIs, and then I can auto-generate my clients, right? There's always this trend to, oh, let's not design an API anymore. Let's just take my functional signature, turn it into something which I then can generate and we call it REST for whatever reason. Don't let that happen. That would be a tragedy. Otherwise, we are recreating the fallacies of the past of closely coupled systems which do not scale, which do not can be managed independently, etc. So APIs worked. APIs, web APIs, simplicity, self-service, low barrier to use, access to valuable resources. So a lot of those frameworks we talked about claim convenience, but they give up on a lot of those points, right? Suddenly this whole API becomes like this opaque mess again. No one understands what's happening underneath, etc. And I'm not personally a user of Evernote. I think they have a great product. But Evernote, for instance, doesn't have a web API. Evernote has a Thrift-based API, a binary API. Go and look at their API description. It's functional. It's function signatures all over again, right? It's like a, 50 to 100 different functions in order to integrate something with Evernote. That's like SOA. Again, while that is possible, if the path is any indication, that didn't seem to scale and didn't seem to kind of make an easy adoption possible, right? So again, just don't throw API design out of the window because suddenly some magic framework appears and just kind of tries to take make all that magic happen for you. Just a reminder, right? Here, focus on him, what he needs. And this is a little pitch. I don't know who knows Job to be Done, that concept from Clayton Christensen. You guys know that? Okay, a few hands. If not, look it up. He has a great book called, well, obviously his greatest book was Innovator's Dilemma. But he actually thinks that his second book, which was written, The Innovator's Solution, which hardly no one knows, is actually the more important book. In that one, he comes up with ways on how you can avoid the innovator's dilemma. And secondly, he creates something called the Job to be Done framework. He says that people don't buy your product. They rent your product or buy your product to do a job. And for you to understand what job it is your customer wants to do enables you to build the right product so that your product is going to be superior to your competitors. So look it up. There's a hashtag JTBD or just Job to be Done, and there's plenty of material on the web. But I found it as a kind of like guidance framework for what I should be building to be very, very relevant. And then ultimately, yes, it may sound common advice, but again, marketing money has a way of confusing things. Pick your technology based on the job you're planning to solve, not based on if it's sexy or gets you into conferences or anything else. Just some some stuff does get you into conferences, right? You can say, hey, I'm the first one using this. Don't count out HTTP yet. I told you, right? Once you take away the power constraint, once you take away the limited bandwidth constraint, HTTP might just work fine. All what's left is how can you use HTTP in some more efficient way in a kind of like pub/sub fashion. And there are attempts out there providing pub/sub-like semantics and patterns on top of HTTP. There's Faye, there's webhooks, a very simple method. Pub/sub hub, there's simple thing protocol. Those are things you should look at because you can always use one of the more fancy protocols later. But with HTTP, at least, you're not betting the house on a technology which may or may not be like Betamax or what was it, Blu-ray versus yeah, exactly. Also, you can look at some of the service providers. They're by now. This is just a small little group of companies I actually thought were very good, of service providers out there who will do the communication layer for you, right? Verdata was started by a group, formerly Alcatel, so they know telco. Xively is the granddaddy. It's a company which was called PatchBay in its old times, then went through various variations once they got purchased by LogMeIn. Bud Labs is a very, very interesting, small, innovative team. They actually realized that a lot of people were using Twitter for doing machine-to-machine communication. So they created a Twitter for machines called Dweet.io. It's a very slim, very kind of simple protocol, but hey, if it gets the job done. PubNub, very aggressive, very innovative company. posting tons of tutorials just to kind of get you excited about what you can do with their network. And then Exosite, that's actually one of the more industrial strength service providers out there for more like the M2M kind of applications. And that concludes my slides.